Good morning. Glad to see everybody for a great Sunday morning class, and we've got a good number here. That's very encouraging. A couple of things. First of all, I did put some new material on the back table for our next study, and we had a suggestion to study 1 Timothy, and we're going to study 1 Timothy. And the reason for that is I've had a lot of questions lately that deal with 1 Timothy. Personal questions. Somebody say, hey, could you comment on this or that? And that's also the book that deals with elders and deacons, and I've had a bunch of questions about elders and deacons lately, and so those are on the back table for whenever. We probably won't be in it next week. We've still got to finish chapter 14 and 15 of Exodus, and but take that. There's the outline of the study. All 13 lessons are outlined on the sort of the syllabus for the course, and then the first group of questions is the introduction, which gets us into like the first two verses of 1 Timothy chapter 1. So if you're interested in that, then go ahead and grab a copy of that sometime before you leave today. It'll stay on the back table, so please get a copy of that. And then after this Wednesday, we'll be putting out some new material this Wednesday, but after this Wednesday, we'll be starting a new study on Wednesday evening, a topical study about the virgin birth of Jesus. That was also by suggestion. And I'm really excited about that study too, because I'm excited to dig into it deeper than I've ever dug into it before. And we've got that all divvied out, and we've got the first page of notes for that as well. So look for that on Wednesday evening. But the new study for 1 Timothy is on the back table, and probably in about 3 weeks we'll be getting to that. Also, my voice sounds really strained today. Every single year when the temperature bottoms out and then it comes right back up to 95 degrees the very next day, my sinuses just flush for about a day, and then afterward I end up with like 2 days where I can't talk. And so Friday and Saturday I couldn't talk much, but I've got my voice mostly back today, so just bear with me today. All right, we are in lesson number 13 today. Lesson number 13, our last lesson of the 10 plagues. And if you don't have a copy of those notes, there are maybe a small stack of about maybe 20, 30 pages on the back table if you need a copy of those notes. So we are in Exodus chapter 14, beginning lesson number 13. All right, so here's what we want to do. We've got a lot in front of us, and we'll just read as we go. And I've got some, under the first question, some preliminary remarks to make, and we'll probably just be in the first question today. There's a lot to talk about under question number 1. So here we go. Lesson 13, question number 1. What happens to Pharaoh just after the children of Israel leave Egypt? This is in verses 1 through 8 of chapter 14. Why do you think this happened? That's based on how you respond to the initial question. And then what is his motivation for pursuing Israel? So let's read those 8 verses, and then I want to go back through and open it up for your thoughts on Pharaoh, his reaction, why he's doing what he's doing, what you think about him. And then I've got some other things for us to talk about before we get to Pharaoh. So let's look at verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart, so that he will pursue them. And I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. Now it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants were turned against the people. And they said, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made ready his chariot and took his people with him. Also he took 600 choice chariots, and all the chariots of Egypt, with captains over every one of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with boldness. What do you think about that section? Any thoughts? What's the response of Pharaoh? Joel? Absolutely. Yeah. when you read this, what did you make of his response? It almost sounds like he's shocked that they've left. Did you get that sense? Because they came and told him this, so the people are gone. He goes, why did we do that? And yet he's the one that let them go. Why do you think he says that? What is it?
Protection from the people.
Yeah, I don't know. We're going to dig into that in just a moment. Maybe there's some other reasons, but it's funny that you read this and he sounds so shocked that the people aren't there anymore when he's the one who told them to leave. So let's do this. A couple of thoughts, and then we'll just dig right into the text. Did you have your hand up, Barry? Okay. All right. This chapter 14, which, by the way, is our last installment of our study, marks a change for the people. Something is about to happen for the people that's going to completely change their life forever. To cross the sea, which they're about to do, is to commit completely to a new way of life and to a new leadership. Drop down in chapter 14 and notice the word that's used to describe what's about to happen to the people. And I think this frames everything we're about to talk about in this chapter. Look at verse 15. Exodus chapter 14, look at verse 15. He says, the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel, go forward. Verse 16, but lift up your rod, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the children of Israel go forth on dry land. And then you've got verse 17, I'm going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians. They're going to follow them. I'll gain honor over Pharaoh and over his army, his chariots, over his horsemen. And all of this, according to verse 13, look at verse 13. Do not be afraid, stand still and see the what? All right, that word now is used to describe all the activity. The hardening of the hearts, the delivering of them from the Egyptians, the crossing of the sea. It's all summarized in that word salvation, which is a word that means what? What does salvation mean? What's an alternate word for that? Salvation means deliverance, okay? So God is going to deliver the people. He is going to save the people. All right, hold that thought. Let's build some other scriptures here that tell us spiritually what's about to happen for the people, what the significance of this event, because this is it. There's a finality to chapter 14, 15. Or hold your place. Go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud. Have we just talked about the cloud? Right? So remember, a pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. They were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. That's what we're talking about right now, right? Chapter 14, they're going to pass through the sea. And in verse 2, interestingly, it says, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So whatever event's being spoken of here in chapter 14, which we're discussing now, it was something of a baptism into Moses. And then he says, verse 3, they all ate the same spiritual food. Verse 4, they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them. And according to verse 4, who was that rock? All right, that rock was Christ. In crossing the Red Sea, it's not as though they weren't literally dunked underwater like we think of baptism in water today, but in crossing the Red Sea, they came under, truly in a sense, they came under the authority and the rule of God through Moses. Because in a person's baptism today, what happens in baptism? Like when we are baptized, what happens when we're baptized? All right, immersion in water, that's the physical act, but what happens spiritually? Sins are washed away, and our allegiance goes to Christ. It's the moment when we're pledging our allegiance to Jesus Christ. In what happens in chapter 14, they're being led by the cloud through the sea. When they do that, what happens to their allegiance? It's completely given to the Lord at this point. But in baptism, sin is washed away. Something is taken away that hinders a person from giving their allegiance to Christ. So think about this, try to make the connection. In passing through the sea, something is taken away from the Israelites that allows them to give their complete allegiance to Moses and God, ultimately God. What's taken away? The Egyptians are taken away. So something is excised from the people, because that's how they're baptized, right? They're baptized in the sense that something is taken away, and that's what's happening here. Just like sin no longer has dominion over us when we're baptized, now in Exodus chapter 14, Egypt no longer hinders the people and has dominion over them. That's what's happening spiritually and physically in this chapter. So there's something to look at here about 1 Corinthians 10, how this is the change of their life to where now they're completely committed to God. Also, this chapter, and other chapters have done this previously, but this chapter also establishes the 4 basic principles of salvation. And other than me mentioning it here, we won't spend a lot of time on it, but just look for this as we go through. The 4 basic principles of salvation are grace, faith, law, and when we say law, we're talking about whatever conditions God gives, and works, and we mean by that works of obedience, right? A response in faith to God. And you see all of that here. That's how they're saved. You've got the conditions, the law of God. Go back to Exodus chapter 14. Look at verse 16. Lift up your rod. That's a command. That's a condition. Stretch out your hand over the sea, divide it, and your children of Israel and the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. All right, that's a condition. They have to do that. That's condition, that's law, and you see that down through verse 18. Their faith, look at verse 22. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground. The waters were a wall to them on the right hand and on the left. So it took great faith to do that. They're obviously obeying at that moment too. And you see the grace of God at work, because in chapter 14, verse 30, the Lord saved Israel that day. He didn't have to do that, out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw all the Egyptians dead on the seashore. So he didn't have to do that. So God did something for them that they did not deserve. So there's law and faith and works of obedience and grace. And those same principles still apply today. And we've seen examples of that. We saw that when we studied Noah, when we looked at the life of Noah. There's grace, faith, law, and works. You'll see the same thing when they get to Jericho, Joshua chapter 6, when God tells the people, I've already given you Jericho, even though they hadn't done it yet. And he gives them conditions. By their faith, they have to do that, and they march around. See the same thing later in the brazen serpent, Numbers chapter 21. He didn't have to save them, but he did. And there's grace, faith, law, and works. This chapter is not unlike others. It's the same 4 principles, right? Did you have your hand up, Tom?
Well, not really, but
Okay.
will now. The crossing the Red Sea was sort of analogous to us burning our bridges today.
Very much so. Yeah, I think so.
Burning the bridges, there is no return. So they were completely free from that.
Yep. I do agree with that. I think that's it. I think this is it. Their tie to Egypt is over with at this point. They're done. Egypt is taken out of the way. And so in that sense, it was a baptism for them. There was a change in their life as a result of that. But you're exactly right. All right. So look at verse 2. There's a couple of places named for us in verse 2. One is Pi-hahiroth. All right. So Pi-hahiroth. And then you've got Migdal and Baal-zephon. So Pi-hahiroth means the mouth of, or the entrance to, and here it would be the sea at the end. So this is the entrance to the sea. We made mention of this in the last lesson, that Sinai is not on the very southwestern tip of Palestine. Like some maps show it on the southwest, sort of the southeast-west corner of Palestine. It's not there. But the Bible tells us that Sinai is in a different place. All right, so hold your place, and let's look at a couple of scriptures. And what we're going to try to do, I can't be specific because I don't know exactly where it is, but I know the general area where it's at based on Bible language. So go back to Exodus 3. Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. Look at verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, later in this discussion, when Moses encounters God on that mountain, remember the burning bushes there, God tells him what about the mountain? You'll do what? You'll come back here and serve me on this mountain. That's Mount Sinai. And if I'm reading verse 1 correctly, the area where this is, his father was the priest of that area. What's the area? It's Midian, okay? So we know that the area is Midian. And Horeb, or Mount Sinai, is in that area. Back to the passage we read last week. Look at Galatians chapter 4. Go with me to Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4. And remember, we said Paul's constructing an allegory here. It's like this. It's a huge comparison he's making between the old and the new. So he talks about verse 24. These things are symbolic. There are two covenants. One from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to the bondage, which is Hagar. And then he says, for this Hagar is Mount Sinai in where? It's in Arabia. That's where the Bible tells us that it's at. Mount Sinai is in Arabia. Okay, so go back to Exodus. Go back to Exodus. And go back to chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. He says in verse 17, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites, the Hittites, or the Hivites and the Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. The one thing that is not mentioned here, and it will later be mentioned, is that God did not take them through the area of the Philistines. In fact, in the very previous chapter, go back to Exodus chapter 13, look at verse 17. It came to pass on their way to Canaan, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines. So their route to the Canaan, to the land of the Hittites, Jebusites, Perizzites, Hivites, all those people, was not through the land of the Philistines, which means they did not go near that southwestern corner of Palestine. They were much further south of that, okay? Now, according to Joshua chapter 4, verse 14, when the people crossed the Jordan River, did they cross the Jordan from the east to the west or from the west to the east? They went from east to west. They were on the east side of the Jordan, and they crossed going west into the land of Canaan, which means they were already on the eastern side of Jordan. The same thing is true in Joshua chapter 1, verse 12, when you remember Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh decided to have their settlement on the east side of the Jordan because that's where the people already were. So Canaan was on the west side of the Jordan from where they were. It implies that what they did in the wilderness was on the east side of it, somewhere out on the east, which was in Arabia, not on the southwest corner of Palestine, but out to the east of that on the other side of the Jordan. So when he says Pi-hahiroth here, he's talking about the entrance to the Gulf of Aqaba. And you can, on a Bible map, it'll be listed there. You'll see the Gulf of Aqaba. It's a big body of water. It's the eastern branch of the Red Sea. So it's still considered part of the Red Sea. It's just the eastern branch of that. There are two other things mentioned here. There's the word Migdal, which means the tower. And my guess is, because I don't know specifically, my guess is that's probably some sort of a land feature. They probably had some sort of tower out there. And then Bel-Zephon, which is probably someplace named after a pagan deity, probably identified with some Egyptian place after the Egyptian deity Typhon, but they camped by the sea. And so if we're understanding this correctly, and based on the complaint of the people, based on their location, they are literally completely trapped by a wall of rock because there were ravines through there. And so they had gone to this big body of water. The body of water stands in front of them. They got walls of rock on the side, and the Egyptians are closing in from the back. So they've got the sea in front of them, rock walls on the side. And we left with this last week. Who put them in that position? God did. Go back to Exodus chapter 13, previous chapter. Look at verse 21. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and by night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. So if they were following the leading of God through the pillar, God led them to that very spot. Why would he do that? Because they're literally trapped. There's nowhere for them to go. Why would he do that? He is about to flex his muscle, so to speak, one more time for the people and take the Egyptians out of the way. In Exodus 14, look at verse 3. We read this just a moment ago, but look at verse 3. There's a reason for this. There's lots of reasons for this, but here's one reason. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, that's why he led them there, they are bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. They're boxed in. What did he do it for? For the purpose of Pharaoh, why did he lead them there? Is that what Pharaoh sees? Pharaoh sees them trapped there. That's what he does. He is throwing off Pharaoh, right? Who's going to think that the Israelites are confused, that they're just wandering aimlessly in the desert, that they're just lost and they've lost themselves in the most strategic point where Pharaoh could attack them. And Pharaoh would actually see this then as an opportunity to do something about it, to attack Israel in this confused state. There's probably an implication here, right? There's probably an implication. A question we probably should ask and maybe imply the answer here is, how would he know exactly where they were? How would he know that? Pharaoh. What do you think, Tom? I think he had spies. That's almost definitely the case. He had spies out there watching them where they were going. It doesn't tell us. I think it's safe to infer that because there's no other way he could have known that except that he had spies out there looking. But there's a really good lesson here. Really good lesson. Just like Egypt was watching the children of Israel in the sense in which, they're baptized in the cloud and baptized into Moses through the cloud and through the sea, in the spiritual sense in which we can make the connection, is the world watching the church. In the very similar sense, the world is watching the church. And do you think the world sees the church sometimes confused and backed in a corner because we put ourselves there? I think it sees that a lot. And what do you think they see? What do you think the world often sees in the church? I think sometimes they see a bunch of hypocrites, people who just profess religion, but they dress up on Sunday and they go to church and they act very religious, and then on Monday they act just like everybody else at work. And so I think they see the church backed in a corner, standing at the sea with nowhere to go, because I think that's how the church is sometimes viewed. Maybe they see us as vulnerable. If you can go back, it's been months now, but back in 1 Samuel 17, we did a lesson, back maybe in the winter, where we were talking about the children of Israel. There's this valley between them. The Philistines are on one side and the children of Israel on the other, and they're sitting there looking at them. Goliath's down there taunting them, and they're just watching the children of Israel do absolutely nothing, literally nothing. They see the church sometimes as vulnerable. We read recently 1 Timothy 5, verses 11 to 14, where it's talking about the younger widows, how they go out and they gossip and they blaspheme the church and they cause blasphemy against the church. Maybe they see that, the world does, as a chance to blaspheme the church. Or like in 1 Corinthians 5, when Paul starts that chapter, he says, you've got a man that's committing fornication with his father's wife. And the world doesn't even act like that. There's not even Gentiles act that way. And what's happening is sometimes, and this is not a rebuke of North Hamilton per se, but it is to say the church in general, sometimes the church is right there at the mouth of the sea. We've put ourselves between rock walls, and the enemy's thinking they're vulnerable because they put themselves in that position. Or do they see light? Do they see Matthew 5, 13 through 16, when we're supposed to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world? Is that what they see? Because the world is watching. So there's a good lesson there. All right, back to verse 4, and I think Joel made allusion to this earlier. We get this language again in verse 4. What did God do to Pharaoh's heart? hardened it. Now, that doesn't mean he took his choice away from him. We already established that this is not God taking choice away, but how did he further harden his heart? What did he do to cause him to do what he did? He led Israel to that point, right? He led them there, and that caused Pharaoh to turn his heart again. So Pharaoh, God accomplished this by the change of direction in Israel and by the previous events in Egypt. Now, in doing this, Pharaoh would pursue the people. God was making sure that he would pursue the people, and it's going to result in God being given honor and glory. Because look down in verse 17. God said, I will indeed harden the hearts of the Egyptians. They're going to follow them so that I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over his army, his chariots, and over his horsemen. So this final display is going to embed the glory that God would get out of all of these events. And plus, the Egyptians would learn again that Jehovah alone is God. And in verse 5, they're going to say that in following. That's what's going to happen. All right, so Pharaoh, obviously in verse 5, gets the report back. And this is where it just seems odd that he would say this, because they come and they tell the king the people have fled. The heart of Pharaoh and his servants have turned against the people. And they said, well, why have we done this? Why did we let them go? I don't understand why we let them go when he's the one who did that. I think this is a moment where reality is starting to set in for Pharaoh, because the lands have been emptied. So what's not getting done now in Egypt? All right, all those bricks that were being made, there's nobody out in the brick fields anymore. Yeah, the free labor force is gone, which means if they're not doing it, the Egyptians are going to have to do it. All right, Goshen is completely emptied. And whatever tax they were getting from the people, it's gone. The brickyards are empty. The fields, all the workers for the fields, empty, gone. And I think reality is setting in. They've let all this, like Barry was saying, all the free labor is gone. All our slave labor is gone. And it was socially and economically paralyzing for Egypt. And Pharaoh is now in panic. Plus, they had been religiously defeated. I mean, God went to the point of not just defeating their gods, but killing their gods in the last plague. So when Pharaoh feels the people are at a disadvantage because they're backed into this corner, his heart is changed and he seeks to destroy them. All right, look at verses 6 and 7. This is what he brings with him. So he makes his chariot ready. And we don't talk about this very much. We don't know for a fact. But when the chariots go down into the midst of the Red Sea, he's assuming what? When he takes all these chariots, what's he assuming that he's going to do? He's going to slaughter the people. You think he went out with them? Get his taste of, bloodlust? And if he's right in the middle of the sea, when the sea closes up, who gets killed too? Pharaoh does. So he's got his chariot. He's down there, verse 6. And he takes his people with him. Now, in verse 7, it tells us he takes 600 choice chariots. How's that distinguished from the ones, and then it says, and, there's be in addition to, and all the chariots of Egypt with captains over every one of them. So he's got all the chariots with captains, but then he's got 600 choice chariots. What's the difference in the choice chariots? Yeah, and that's it, multiple people. The best we know is that the choice chariots here would translate something like this. These are selected chariots. These are tested chariots. And regarding these chariots, many have commented that these were war chariots. They were specifically designed for that. They generally were drawn by 2 to 4 horses, and they carried about 3 people on the inside. One would be the driver. The other would be a defender to make sure that there were no weapons that could get through, like arrows and such, spears and such. The other was the combatant. They were instruments of massacre. That's what they were. Typically, they were open to the rear, so there would be a need for a defense. They were semicircular, like a board you would stand on that would be semicircular. The rim would be about 2 foot high, 2.5 feet high, above the standing board, and there would be 2 wheels. They were very fast moving. And so these 600, along with the 3 people we presume that would be in each of these, would be about 1,800 people, 1,800 soldiers just in these 600 choice chariots. But then he takes with him all the chariots all the chariots with a captain in them. So potentially thousands of chariots and tens of thousands of soldiers. Now, even if he had tens of thousands of soldiers, remember what we said the estimate for the people moving out of Egypt was? Into the millions, maybe 2.5 million to 3 million people. And so there is a massive amount of people going out, but they're not armed, right? They don't have defensive weapons. They don't have offensive weapons. They don't have anything other than what they would have, instruments they might have in their hands, something like that, or to fight with their fists. But he intends for this to be a slaughter. He's going to go slaughter these people. He's going to just flay them right there in the middle of this area that they're at. And so watch in verse 8. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel, and the children of Israel went out with boldness. So this is a reflection on, before the children of Israel start whining about where they are, you'll see that beginning in verse 9 and following. When they went out of Egypt, they went out with boldness, they went out with confidence. So in the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about a couple of lessons that I think we could learn from the first 8 verses of chapter 14, because next week we'll get into the actual, what God does to confuse the armies and how they get through the Red Sea. So a couple of lessons. We made mention in one of our previous lessons that God sometimes will, he led them around the way of the Philistines. He didn't want them to go through there because he was protecting their faith. But there's also this lesson. God sometimes puts us in circumstances where we encounter our enemies. Sometimes he does that for our benefit and for the benefit of the enemies. He doesn't do it to tempt us. According to James 1:13 through 15, God is not responsible for temptation, but he does do it for opportunities. Now go with me, hold your place, go with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Let's make a modern day application. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. All right, look at verse 3. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. Then in verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. All right, so our warfare today is very different. It's not a physical warfare. We don't fight it with physical weapons, for the Lord, that is. And it's spiritual, right? We're fighting with words. Sometimes God leads us around our enemies like he did with the Philistines, right? In chapter 13, verse 17 and following, he does that. But it's clear that God put his people in a position where the enemy would come in contact. At least they would come close to them. And sometimes he does that to us. Now today, if God puts us in a position where we come in contact with our spiritual enemies, for what purpose does he do that according to what we just read? When he says, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. What would be the purpose that he would put us in contact with spiritual enemies today?
Same reason he did with the Egyptians is to harden their faith and dependence upon God.
Yeah. If we come in contact with us, let's say that you meet somebody at work and they're nice enough, and you get to know them a little bit better, and they learn that you're a Christian, and they say, I didn't know that you're a Christian. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I think that's the stupidest thing in the world that you, all of a sudden now, the battle is on. What's your responsibility toward that person now? I'm going to change his heart. I'm going to change your heart. Your job is to try to now, in a very kind way, to try to cast down those bad arguments, to try to bring them to the point that they can be loyal to Christ. That's why he does that. So sometimes God puts us in the circumstances that we do encounter our enemies for the purpose of helping to convert them. All right, here's the second lesson. Our attitudes and our actions are meant to have a positive influence on the people around us. It should never be the case that people look at us, and the world is looking at us, that they would look at us and they would say, those poor, pitiful Christians, they're just lost and stuck, and they should never do that. What they ought to do is look at us and have very good influence from our actions and from our attitude. Look at Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14, verse 7. He says, for none of us lives to himself, and no one dies to himself. You know, it's like a ripple effect. You throw a pebble in the water and there's ripples that come from that. Everybody's doing that. We all have influence, whether it's good or whether it's bad. We just pray that it's good influence. And then I think the third thing is, it is very tragic. It is very tragic when an evil heart, defeated by God, persists in resisting the will of God. And it reminds me of Hebrews chapter 6, verses 4 through 6, when it says, it is impossible for those who have essentially been converted, because he gives all those characteristics of conversion. They've tasted of the heavenly gifts, and they've been partakers of all the wonderful joys of Christianity. If they should do that and they fall away, to renew them again to repentance, seeing that they crucify to themselves the Son of God afresh. And Pharaoh is just like that, right? He's been defeated by God and given a moment where he could actually do something good and change and be positive. He persists in opposing the people of God, and that's a really tragic thing when that happens. All right, so next week we'll pick up with question number 2 about how the people react to Egypt. And you think, our God just delivered us, and 10 marvelous miracles down in Egypt, God's got this, and he's going to deliver us. And yet in that very moment, the people just fold in their faith. And we'll find out how they're given some confidence, and then we'll deal with some of the other questions too. All right, thank you so much. There are copies of the 1 Timothy study, the first lesson, and then the outline on the back table if you'd like to have a copy of that. Again, you probably won't need it after next week, but it's back there in case you want it. So thank you so much for your attention today. Appreciate it.